All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I am recording the talk today. We'll be putting it up on the department YouTube as well afterward. So Dr. Andrea Martin received her PhD in psychology down the street at NYU. She's currently a Lisa Meitner Research Group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics and a principal investigator at the Nonder Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, Neuroimaging at Radboud University. Her research combines insights from the language sciences, computation, and neuroscience to understand how language is represented and processed in the mind and brain. She'll be speaking today about her recent work on how information can be hierarchically composed during language processing, building from sounds to words to sentences, and how we can computationally model this process. This idea of building up complex meaning over time is something that my lab, and I know other labs both in the psychology department and throughout Columbia, are fascinated by, and we're very excited to have her presenting with us today. Her talk will be about an hour. We'll have some time at the end for questions. So please use the Q&A feature if you'd like to send in questions. Dr. Martin said she's fine being interrupted with questions in the middle of the talk, and we can also come back to questions at the end. Great, take it away.
Great, thank you. So just keep in mind that I can't see any of you. So I'm a little bit here having my own private podcast. So if there's a question or you want me to explain something, please interject in some way. And if I don't respond, it's because I didn't see the message or didn't see you. So then please maybe use your voice or get Chris to interrupt, because I really can't tell what's going on. So here we go anyway. All right, so I usually introduce my perspective on what I find fascinating about language with this cartoon example about a blue and white striped sweater. But in such a difficult year, or what might be turning into difficult years, it feels absurd to tell you about how a blue and white striped sweater can tell us about language or the structure of our minds or how our brains might create both. But I'm sticking to it anyway, because now more than ever, I think it helps to keep things simple, even when we're indulging in psycholinguistic or metascience escapism, which is what I have to offer you today. So here we go with blue and white striped sweater. Not a big deal, right? But compare it with blue, white, and striped sweaters. So these utterances are highly similar. So the sequence of words is nearly identical, but they mean very different things. And that's because of the hidden structure of language and the fact that language is compositional, or it can be built up or broken down into parts. And it's actually structure that makes such distinctions possible. Okay, yeah, so this is maybe not a mind blower for this audience, but now I'm really going to blow your minds by being offensive. So here's a very offensive cartoon way of representing structure in language. So this is a patently false, wrong cartoon, but I'm using it to illustrate a point, which is that in the first case, the adjectives blue, white, and striped are combined together to modify sweater. And the result is that we then have one sweater with blue and white stripes. But in the second case, each adjective has its own individual branch in our cartoon structure, leading it to be combined individually with sweater, resulting in three sweaters, each with one adjective's property. There's also even ambiguity in this example, so you can combine things further. But the point is here that in order for there to be a meaningful difference in the linguistic structure, we have to be able to perceive that from something that doesn't physically have it, per se. So then the question becomes, how are we bringing these notions of linguistic structure, whether they're veridical or not, into our theories of language and language processing? So in other words, not only are the formal descriptions at stake, which is not what I'm really going to talk about today, but more, how do we use what we know about language and about computation and about the mind and brain already to constrain our approach to studying language and language processing? Okay, so how do we do that in practice as a field? Well, the short answer is we don't do it so much. As we know from daily life, tools like autocorrect and Google Translate and from professional life language models, they don't always get it right. They often miss core aspects of language, core aspects of meaning, and in the extreme, this can often even be dangerous. But I believe that the reason why language models don't get it right is because of how language or claims about linguistic representation are represented in these models. And that's as a sequence of associations. So no matter how high dimensional or conditionalized, whether you have one word relating to another, to next to it, or probability of one word given the next, or the distribution of it in a large corpus, that's different from representing a structure or a grammar, although Pache aren't in grammars, which is an emerging field in natural language processing. But what this approach in general of associationism misses out on is actually what's miraculous about language. And that's that we can understand things that are not highly probable or predicted. We can understand things that we've never heard before. For example, like blue and white striped whale. So I can't be sure, but it's unlikely that you ever heard blue and white striped whale before. but I can be sure that it wasn't a predictable utterance for you to hear in this moment. So even though you recently heard blue and white striped sweater, and you may even have thought of it, as I said, blue and white striped, you still heard blue and white striped whale in the end. And the point is that a model that's based on associations alone cannot and does not explain how we do this. Neither do these models explain how we say things that are novel or unexpected, or even how we say just variants of things that we have heard. So it's obvious that statistical association and prediction play an important role in language processing and in language behavior, but they can't be the whole story. So why do we only include them in our models, right? So nonetheless, the dominant models in psychology and neuroscience and artificial intelligence are built on associations and not on structure. And it's structure that explains how we know what blue and white striped whale means, right? So you can see this as a problem. And it actually comes down for language specifically to the fact that language is actually mathematically very interesting. It's an example of a system that is both algebraic and statistical. And I think we actually don't pay enough attention to that fact. So in fact, the mathematician, Dr. Andrea E. who works on category theory, has, among other things, I think, really carved nature at its joints with regard to language here, and says it more succinctly than many in our field managed to, which is that language is algebraic, since words can be combined to form longer expressions. Language is also statistical, since some expressions occur more frequently than others. So you can check out her blog, which I've listed here, for accessible and insightful lessons on category theory and other mathematical formalisms for language. But her pithy observation leads to what I see as the challenge of explanation that language as a capacity embodies for cognitive science and for cognitive neuroscience. And that's basically using what we know about what has to be there in the formal descriptions of linguistic structure, which linguistics gives us a pretty good handle on, to then shape our work in psychology, neuroscience, and computation. So in some sense, what I'm saying now is not very, it's not a future that's different from the past or something, but it's very much in the context of what I might call the cognitive science winter of interdisciplinarity. That is the promise of interdisciplinarity that CogSci brought us, but that we haven't yet succeeded in fully transducing concepts from one domain to another, for example, from linguistics to psychology to neuroscience. But I don't think it's because it's a hard problem, not because we haven't been trying or because it's not possible. But anyway, the way forward that I see is that we need to establish mutual constraint for theories and models of language from the different disciplines that we have knowledge that impacts those models from. So I'll refer to this approach as finding constraints. And I want it to sort of catalyze a way of looking at language as it's embedded in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, such that we can explain the formal properties that set it apart. So how does language become algebraic through statistical experience? Is it abduction over that experience that allows us to refine representations in the brain that are not only purely associations? And can we discover the properties of the language system in the mind and brain that stay faithful to all that we know about linguistic structure, about processing within the mind's infrastructure, and about how that infrastructure might be manifested in the brain? So one way to say that more simply is to say, what are the minimal claims about representation that any model or theory of language has to incorporate? And minimally, I would say it has to have the capacity to represent structure, but also be sensitive to statistical information. So then what are the system properties that lead to that, right? What are the system properties that lead to structure being algebraic, for example? And not to drive the point home too many times, but there's so much that we already know from basic linguistics that we haven't been able to earnestly incorporate into our psychological, computational, and neuroscientific work on language. For example, even basic notions like constituency in linguistics, we struggle to know how to denote those in a computational model, never mind in a theory of what the brain represents. But in any case, we have to face this problem, and the way to do it is then to try to stitch what we do know, for example, by staying faithful to key basic properties of formal linguistics, to be faithful to tenets of psycholinguistics and psychology, what we know about language processing, to be ultimately computationally tractable, which is a huge other can of worms that would be a totally different talk to go into, and also to be neurobiologically and neurophysiologically informed. So those are the sort of constraints that I want to place on theory building and language, but I welcome you, if language is not your jam, to think about it in your own subject area. What are the constraints that I know minimally have to be true in order for my model building and theory building to be effective? And so practicing science in this way sort of stipulates that we're going to start with a capacity to be explained, right? So we don't want a theory of a task or a theory of an effect, but we want a capacity that's going to be explained. This, of course, inches closer to an elephant in the room, which is what is an explanation in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience. And I think that's a different podcast. That's by no means my expertise, the philosophy of cognitive science. But to me, the modeling endeavor is about trying to establish the first principles of, for example, a neural system that has the capacity for human language. So that means that the goal of the model is to explain, not to predict. And that also means that successful prediction is not an explanation. And yeah, I wish it were, but it's not. So we want a model that explains how language and language behavior arises, not a system based on implausible principles that can mimic anything through statistical approximation. This is an even more important point, given Kolmogorov complexity and multiple realizability, the fact that it's not a valid inference that just because a system returns X or computes X, that it does so in the way that the human mind or brain might do. And that's a fallacy that we fall into a lot in computational approaches to language. But the way out of that, I think, is to hold on to our first principles, or in other words, the constraints of the system that we know we can't disregard. So let's take a short philosophical interlude, because I was asked to also speak a little bit about some of the meta-science work that's been going on in my lab. And we're going to then just ever so slightly bump up against the elephant in the room regarding explanations in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, and we won't resolve it. We'll at least talk about what some of the issues are that we need to face. So I've been talking a lot about constraining our models and our theories, but what we know has to be true. Well, that's great if we know what's true, but that's harder than it sounds, right? But minimally, neuroscience should constrain our explanations of cognitive capacities, right? And here I'm quoting some work from the philosophy of science and the philosophy of neuroscience from Kaplan. So otherwise, computational explanations can be provided via autonomous functional decomposition without delineating underlying mechanisms, neural or otherwise, that implement computational processes. And this also speaks to the idea of multiple realizability. And similarly, failing to describe why the how of something works is not a success. So a model will only have explanatory force to the extent that it reveals aspects of the causal structure of a mechanism. And it will lack explanatory force to the extent that it fails to describe that structure. So in other words, when we're building our models and our theories, we need to ask, why does a particular solution work? And we would like that why to fit into the broader sensibility of the theory. So that means that the principles and mechanisms behind it should also be consistent with what we're espousing our theory to be about. And the way to make this more concrete is to think back. So if you have a statistical model of language and it can predict the next word, you want to know why it can do that and whether the principles and mechanisms that lead it to be able to do that are plausible and part of the structure of your mechanistic model. And then furthermore, a constraint you could put on there to say, okay, are there reasons to believe that these things that we've invoked are in any way brain-like? Okay. Another way to approach the problem, I think, I often find, if you can't figure out what it is, you can say what it's not. I do this a lot. So if it is admittedly very hard to build a well-reasoned, but constrained plausible theory, but we can say what wouldn't count as that, and that's a good place to start. So statistical approximations without the algebraic anywhere in view aren't going to be sufficient for language. So a collection of results showing that the linguistic phenomena X can be learned by a system under Y circumstances is also not like the breadth of a theoretical model that I would find explanatory. If we have a purely descriptive theory that could describe, for example, a pattern of brain activity, but it doesn't pay any attention to sort of the behavioral context or what actually is being performed or the representations that are being computed, I find that also less compelling. And again, also finding disregard for first principles or the multiple constraints that I talked about before. All right, so now to bring this back to some of that meta-science work that I spoke about before. So this is a recent paper with my postdoc, Dr. Olivia Guest, where we try to argue that actually just even engaging in a simple act of computational modeling can help you build the theory that you want to. So that's to say, in the case of language, if we want to explain our capacity for language, any viable model has to also start with the capacity to have the formal properties that we see in natural language. And even just by doing that, that would put us in a very different starting position to most contemporary computational approaches. So I'll return to that shortly, actually, in the rest of the talk. But first, let me briefly explain what Olivia and I wanted to emphasize. And this is, again, something where I think it's handiest to think about it for your own question. Is the idea here that merely by expressing your theory as a formalism or specification, and then expressing that specification as an implementation, which I'll explain more in a second, through this process, you'll uncover aspects of your theory that you had not made explicit before. And then you'll see that the constraining relationship between theory, specification, and implementation are actually crucial for you to be able to draw the inferences that you want to about your work. So what does that actually mean in practice? So in the paper, we use this example that we got from Twitter, actually. It was tweeted by this Twitter account from Matt's library. And it's an example. We chose this example for the paper because it's actually not laden with baggage from cognitive science. So where we all have our own jargon and own beliefs and own dogmas, which is fun and important, but sometimes it gets in the way of thinking about the modeling process in a sort of meta way. So we decided to use something where we didn't have such a close connection to cognition. And the question here was, which scenario gives you more pizza? So in the paper, we say, imagine it's Friday night, it's Friday, you're gonna order some pizza. Which pizza deal is gonna give you more pizza in the end? So somewhat counterintuitively, one pizza in this case is more than two. Obviously, this is fungible, right? The notion of oneness and two-ness here is not important, but you can already see that even by this short point, we've only talked about pizza and how we can maximize it in a very brief way. We've already made a myriad of assumptions to get to this point, right? It's that the surface area is what makes a pizza order desirable. We want to maximize surface area. That means that we haven't said we don't care about crust to toppings ratio, apparently. Apparently stuffed crust isn't a thing anymore, stuff like that, right? That's all missing. But in an attempt to unpack how laden our models are with assumptions, or what I like to call modeler's choice, we derived a path function to describe the inference process in developing a model, or the path of scientific inference. So here, I've taken an example from the paper. I'm going to fill it in with the pizza example so to get everyone on the same page. But I encourage you to do this for your own question. I'll do it for my question that is the rest of the talk is about in a second. But for now, I'll just go through this example. So if we're modeling the choice about what pizza deal to order, it's not usually our goal in cognitive science, but that's, again, actually why we chose this example. But if we start from the background assumption, which we call framework in the model, that maximal pizza is pleasing, we can then start to constrain our thinking on the theory level. And the idea here in the path model is that each step constrains the one, is constrained by the one above it, right? So obviously this is not a worked out theory of anything, but as you'll see in our paper, I'll just note, we espouse a sort of radical Lakatoshian view that even a natural language sentence by itself, when deconstructed, is a theory. And so that brings us to here our theory about pizza choice, which is that the takeout deal with the most pizza area is maximally pleasing. Here, then you see in these red boxes here is where the action is. So here, when we go from theory to specification, this is when our assumptions become sort of like critical, right? So here, we're taking our theoretical claim, transducing it into a formalism, and operationalizing it. So here, we're going to say that maximizing pizza surface area is the sum of all the surface areas of the pizzas in the order, which crucially here we denote merely as the area of a circle. We all know that pizzas are not perfect circles, right? They're not mathematical objects, they're pizzas. So already you can see here that in order to make a model of this process, we've made assumptions that we know are already departing from ground truth, right? That's, of course, at the heart of modeling. But the point of this is to show you how each step constrains the next and constrains actually the veracity or the value of the inference in relation from the model to the object in the world. So each step in the path constrains the one below it, and you can move back up to the previous step in a sort of iterative way as a way to improve your assumptions and refine your method or refine your trajectory through towards scientific inference, right? But from our view, much of the work that we have to do in cognitive science and neuroscience is from theory to specification to implementation. So I was just speaking about how we have made the radical assumption that a pizza is a circle. But then from that, then we're going to have to implement that specification, that formalism, in, for example, Python, which is what we have here, right? But there's a myriad of other ways that we could express that in implementation. And even in that, there are certain assumptions that we take when we take a certain specification and implement it in a certain way. So now, just to link back, back from our sort of segue of metascience and philosophy of cognitive science, we go back to the modeling points I made in the beginning. Here, I've tried to do my own homework exercise to my own model, and you can see it's challenging. It's not simple. So the toy example of the path model here is applied to my question in language. So if I want to start by trying to explain how a neural system can be compositional, I operationalize that as having value variable independence. So I'm already saying my proxy for compositionality is value variable independence. That's already a huge assumption. A lot of people would not agree with that, but that is what, and I'm just going to be explicit about that's what I'm doing there, right? And I'm also going to say that a system, the level of analysis of the brain that I'm doing is a neurophysiological system with assembly level organization and nothing further than that, right? So then, to go further in the world of my model, I'm going to say that, okay, I want the system to achieve value variable independence. I decide to specify that as the dynamic binding of information or representations in time, right? That's a choice. Then that instantiation that I pick of this is a settling neural network that computes via oscillations, right? DORA, which I'll talk about later in the talk. So maybe this is a polemic view, but without this starting point, I would merely be showing that it's possible to produce a pattern with the neural network, which is not at all surprising. But by starting with a system architecture that I already know violates the tenets that I think the system that I'm trying to model already has, that's just a non-starter for me. So by going through this and trying to work out, how each assumption I make at each level of the path model constrains or affects the next, I learn more about sort of the implicit side of my theory that I had not yet articulated and therefore didn't know the ramifications for my inference. All right. Okay. Now let's sort of zoom back out from our metascience exercise back to talking about models of language that are faithful, both to what we know about linguistics and the brain. So I want to start from the principle that brain computations are extended in time and are distributed across neural networks whose dynamics reflect the computation that occurs within them, which in turn, those dynamics are what expresses linguistic structure. I've just sort of shown my cards. So now I'm going to devote the rest of the talk to trying to show instances of this from different areas of neuroscience computation and formal work. All right, so each subsection applies constraints from one domain onto another. So first I'm going to talk about how computation in psychology, how we can use time in a neural network to encode structure. And I'm going to talk about this because I'm talking about so much work going on in the lab, I'm going to talk on it on a very sort of surface level. And if you have more detailed questions, please feel free to ask me. So the main way to think about this problem is how do we go from a linear sequence of words to a structure and a meaning? So to be pithy, we know a lot about the brain circuits involved in understanding language, but not much about the computations and processes themselves that lead to the generation of structure. And representing structure isn't simple, we know that. And we as language researchers, we aren't the only ones in cognitive science who face this difficult problem, as many of you have seen. So categories and concepts, memory, perception, a lot of this has the same question about how do we infer the presence of a structured representation from a minimal sensory cue. So we can learn, I think, actually, as language scientists, from how other disciplines have faced this problem, as long as we do actually face it. So let me lay the problem out in more detail. To perceive the difference in the blue sweater examples from the beginning, listeners must exploit grammatical cues, so the rhythm and intonation in speech, and map incoming speech onto the grammatical structures and resulting meanings. So it's likely that we do this by combining our internal knowledge of language with speech or sign as it comes in, right? So in both cases, we've got time, and in the case of sign, we've got time and space-time that are sort of the domain over which we have to do these computations. So where are we starting from then? Essentially, we have our bursts of energy in speech that we perceive as a sequence of words in time. Already there's a ton of processing going to get to that point. Or a sequence of movements, gestures, and forms across space, time, and sign that also leads to perceptions of phonemes and words. But it's not surprising that psychological models of language processing have always stressed the importance of timing and rhythm in perceiving structure and meaning. So timing, rhythm, and prosody, etc., are critical for generating syntactic structure and meaning. These are quite ancient ideas in psycholinguistics. There's generations of work on this, but yet they're seldom taken up really into computational models and neurobiological theories. They are starting to be, and there's some important historical exceptions. But what I want to advocate here is that we should all try to systematically exploit time and rhythm in processing and computation to understand how structure is uncovered and represented in the brain. So somehow we have to go from the sequential processing to the structured representation. Okay, but first a quick primer on brain rhythms, which is going to be one of the sort of indices that I use in this talk. So already here we can see how we need to incorporate a constraint from psychology, time and rhythm, into how we think about understanding neural signals related to language. And so now we have to incorporate constraints from neuroscience, that the brain computes with distributed neural networks that cycle in and out of activation. And here to illustrate what that means in a very general sense, we see that the raw, this is EEG, so sensor data from scalp EEG. We see the raw EEG can vary in its phase and power, and how that variation might occur contributes to classically measured potentials, signals like event-related brain potentials in language that were widely used in language processing research. But brain rhythms contain more and different information to those signals. And the brain is inherently rhythmic in its processing. It's never not rhythmic. And speech itself is quasi-rhythmic. So it's not a coincidence that these things, that both of that the sort of sensor and the object have this rhythmic property. So if we assert that time and computation over time are important for the system, we can get maybe a step closer to accounting for how linguistic structure is formed in the mind and brain, given that we know that the brain is rhythmic and speech input itself, while not containing structure physically, is quasi-rhythmic in its physicality. Okay. So now I'm going to tell you about a single example of the constraint approach that's based on a highly influential study from Nye Ding and colleagues from 2016 that used synthesized speech and a continuous simulation paradigm. So just a stream of syllables where participants either perceived words, phrases, and sentences or didn't. And these synthesized syllables were presented at an isochronous fixed rate of 1/4 of a second, 250 milliseconds per syllable or word, or 4 hertz. Which is fixed, and it's comprehensible, but it doesn't have the natural intonation of speech. But the remarkable result from this study is that the brain shows peaks in spectral power at 1 and 2 hertz, even though there's nothing in the physical signal at those frequencies. So you can see that by comparing B to A and C here. And the authors argue that this reflects the cortical tracking of words, phrases, and sentences. But then the question is, how are those phrases and sentences generated? Is the brain just tracking their timing, or is it computing them? And that's what's causing the 1 to 2 hertz readout that we see here. So we asked if a computational model that uses time to bind information and gives us oscillations as it computes could reproduce this signal when it processed the same sentence. So I said earlier that we can learn from other domains and how they address the problem of representing structure. And this is, again, where we zoom out to our cognitive science level view, where we say, okay, across cognitive science, we see that there are 2 systems, traditions, or cultures that surround modeling. And here I'm describing work that was developed in collaboration with Alex Dumas at the University of Edinburgh. And the background that goes into this forms actually a whole other talk. But the short rendition of it is, as I mentioned earlier, is that other areas in cognitive science, like analogy and relational reasoning, have faced the structured representations in a neural network problem. They wanted to solve it for different reasons, like being able to perform relational reasoning tasks and analogy. But John Hummel and Alex Dumas have pioneered the symbolic connectionist tradition, which represents, to my mind, a nice synthesis of what's often seen as a great ontological and epistemological divide, right? So you've got your feature-based whole object representations in the connectionist tradition, that's now in modern times now, deep learning culture, and then that's somehow starkly in contrast with structured representations or symbolic systems. But what Alex did in his PhD was take a symbolic system that had been instantiated in a connectionist neural network by John Hummel and make it be able to learn structured representations from unstructured feature vectors. I can talk more at length about that, but not in this talk, unfortunately. So anyway, this culminated in a model called DORA, which is discovery of relations by analogy, which descended from the LISA model. So it's a model of relational reasoning and analogy, and it has simulations of behavior. So it simulates more than, at the point when I originally made this slide, 25 plus, now I think it's around the 30 reasoning tasks and their developmental trajectory. And just to be very brief, I'll tell you sort of the things that sets it apart from a typical connectionist network. So early symbolic connectionist models like LISA, they instantiated a role filler binding calculus in a neural network, which is very interesting. But there was no learning of this role filler binding calculus. It was hard coded. In contrast, Dora learns a predicate calculus from unstructured feature vectors. And it does so by having these few properties that it distinguish it from a typical connectionist network. So it's a settling network. It's the focus of the network is not on an input-output relationship, but rather on changing the internal states of the model. It has functionally separable banks of units, which allow it to pass activation and inhibition and control the flow of that information separately, and that's important. Otherwise, it uses heavy in learning, but crucially, it has a sensitivity to time as an informational degree of freedom, and it does that by having leaky integrators that take lateral inhibition and those integrative inhibitors at different timescales, and that's key to the ability to learn structure from unstructured representations. Okay, now zooming back to our particular example of this study from Niding and colleagues, we asked if this model that uses time to bind information and gives off oscillations as it computes could reproduce this signal when it processed the same sentence. So here's a simulation of the Ding and colleagues' data using Dora versus an RNN. So here the blue line represents the human data and the dotted red spikes are the activation of Dora. So we used an RNN which doesn't use time or structure to process information. You can see that in black, but the crucial thing is that both models perform to the same criterion. That's predicting the next word, which is a standard performance metric in natural language processing. So both models are identical in their performance. But the key difference is that the RNN didn't produce functional structures as it's processed, nor oscillations to do so, but Dora did. In fact, in order to produce the structures, Dora has to give off these oscillatory patterns of activation. And this suggests that the brain rhythms that we're observing in our other readout might have something to do with the binding of words into phrases over time, right? All right, so our interim conclusion, I haven't gone into great detail for time reasons, but I'm happy to talk about it during the question sections, is that by taking distributed representations in a neural network and creating a phase set or binding them together in time can allow us to form structure representations across that network, leading to time-based binding across layers, right? And that's what allows you to go from a sequential input to a sort of hierarchy of structures, and then you're giving off oscillations that mimic the cortical ones by implementing this mechanism. So in a sense, we've constrained our processing by time and by neurophysiology writ very large in order to see these linguistic structures as embodied in a predicate logic. So this is a candidate explanation for how perceiving hierarchy from a sequence, so that it's combining words into phrases, produces these oscillations. All right, again, I'm zooming through to give you a taste of all the different things going on in the lab. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit more about more data that we're gathering about how linguistic structure might be present in brain rhythms. So now the question is, if we can observe the modulation of brain rhythms related to linguistic structure and meaning over and above the response to sentence prosody and lexical context. So that the experiment I told you about before that we did the modeling based on made a big deal to sort of normalize the natural variation of speech in order to get a better understanding of how the brain response works. But in this project I'm going to tell you about, my PhD student, Greta Caulfield, sort of wanted to do the opposite, wanted to say, no, I want to keep in all that natural variation because I think the brain takes advantage of it. But can we find a way to sort of model out the role of sentence prosody and lexical context to see whether the pattern of brain rhythms is still modulated by the presence of linguistic structure or not? So that's what Greta Caulfield did. She's recently graduated and is now Dr. Greta Caulfield. And here we asked whether mutual information between the brain response and the stimulus increased as a function of the presence of linguistic structure in our stimulus. So Greta created 3 different conditions, which I'll tell you about in a second, but then basically takes these conditions, takes the wave file, the syllable envelope, and makes a spectrogram of it, takes the spectral representation of the stimulus and compares it to the modulation spectra of the brain response and asks about the relationship in terms of mutual information between these 2 signals. So here are our stimuli. So we have sentences things like in English, timid heroes pluck flowers and the brown birds gather branches. And then we have its carefully created prosodic Jabberwocky. So it has the modulation spectra that the sentence condition does, so they're indistinguishable. But the wordless condition here has all the words that are in the sentence, but in an order that prevents a sentence from being formed, right? So the wordless condition has all the lexical content, but a different prosody and rhythm. And the phrases and sentences, we made sure that they were not easily constructed from a spoken stimulus. So here, Greta found that brain rhythms track linguistic structure, even when you control for the effect on the brain from the prosodic, acoustic, and lexical properties of speech. So Greta showed that when you cut up the brain response into phrase length, word length, and syllable length parts, as you see in the columns of this graph, you see that on the time scale of words and phrases, the brain is more attuned to linguistic structure than to the prosodically and lexically matched controls. So you can see this by the fact that when you look at the sentence condition, the green dot and its distribution is always higher than the orange, the prosodic control, and also than the purple, the word control. So this is evidence that this tracking effect that we're finding is not acoustic or prosodic or lexical in nature, but is actually related to the presence of linguistic structure. And that's because sentences, the most structured and compositional thing that we tested, organize the brain response the most. And this is beyond our acoustic and prosodic matched controls. And this is interesting to us because it suggests that what's important for these brain rhythm signals is not only the timing, but it's also the content, right? So it's not just the time scale that something occurs on, but the particular content that's driving the response. And this finding is consistent with a principal role for endogenous rhythms, as we proposed in a recent paper with Lars Meyer and Yue Sun, where we argue that neural signals appear rhythmic despite the pseudo-rhythmicity of speech, actually due to the contributions from internally generated linguistic representations. So you can think of those as sort of a control structure that's exerting a rhythm down on that quasi-rhythmic sensory information that's coming into the system. So to better understand how these internal representations or expressions of the internal language model are at play, the next project I want to tell you about asks, how does the brain represent phrases and sentences when they're forced to take up the same amount of time and be as physically similar as possible? So this is the PhD work of Fan Bai in my lab. And he did this experiment where he made stimuli that were all 1 second long, 4 syllables of a quarter of a second each in Dutch. So things like the ball is blue versus the blue ball. And he made them as physically similar as possible. So the same number of syllables, the same duration of stimulus, and the same root mean squared power, while still being judged to be good examples of the ball is blue or the blue ball by native speakers. So you can see that they're as physically similar as can be while still getting these judgments right. And what found is that there's more phase synchronization for sentences than for phrases. So this is EEG data, and that the way that we could really tease apart phrases and sentences in the brain when they're physically matched is through phase synchronization. That there's more phase synchronization in the connectivity networks for sentences than for phrases. This is a coarse-grained prediction of a system that's organized the way Dora is, where phase sets or distributed codes that fire in a temporal pattern with one another, for example, a word in relation to another word, or both words in relation to a phrase. So in sentences, there are more of these phase set relationships than in phrases, and that's because there are more constituents. This is an important level of organization in linguistics. So the organization of neural assemblies, as much as that can be reflected in phase synchronization, which I know there's many steps of inference there, it's increased for sentences even when they take up the same time or have the same envelope or spectral shape as a phrase. So Fan is also working on these spatiotemporal encoding models of the neural response that basically convolve the stimulus with the neural response. And he managed so far to get good separability by hemisphere about whether a phrase or sentence was presented. And so notably here you can see that it's only within the theta and delta bands where our predictors were above chance. And this suggests that theta and delta play key roles for the brain's processing of phrases and sentences, which is not surprising given existing literature. But finally, Fan wanted to examine one of the clearest predictions of existing models of speech processing that use brain rhythms. So Giraud and Popel, 2012, which states that phase amplitude coupling, so the relationship between phase and power across frequency bands theta and gamma, is crucial for segmenting syllables and decoding phonemes from speech. So here we found no difference between the theta gamma coupling for phrases and sentences, but we do find increased theta gamma coupling when participants were listening to speech stimuli as compared to resting state. So this was an interesting, we gathered sort of evidence that saw, yes, the theta gamma coupling is important for speech comprehension, but it doesn't make a distinction between whether a phrase or a sentence was presented. I found that interesting. So found results suggest that phase synchronization is what demarcates the difference in the brain between temporally matched phrases and sentences. And that's consistent with a similar observation that John Brennan, a good friend of mine from grad school, and I recently found in a paper that we did with his now famous naturalistic EEG data set. So he has a bunch of people listening to Alice in Wonderland, just audiobook of that story, and then we are able to do all these interesting analyses of these. And this is the first time we looked at the brain rhythms in that data set and just basically asked, whether we can find a difference in phase synchronization in these different, in theta, delta, and gamma based on whether a phrase was being ended. So here we've got our function words and our content words, and you can see when brackets are closed or when linguistic structure is being finally fomented, you can see that in the orange condition, we've got more phase synchronization. There are more organization of the neural networks in play than when that's not the case. So this is consistent with a principal rule for endogenous rhythms as we proposed in the recent papers that I've listed here, where signals appear more rhythmic despite the pseudorhythmicity of speech due to the contributions of internally generated linguistic representations, or due to what I like to think of as a model we have internally in our brains that's shaping how these percepts are being organized. Okay, so now going through our constrained examples here, we're now getting to a part where I'm gonna talk about work where we try to use a little bit of what we know from psychology to account for human behavior with language models that are so popular these days. So this is a project led by Kas Koopmans, a PhD student in my group, in collaboration with Kartikeya Kaushik, who's a master's student and also a research assistant in the group. And here we used an LSTM model to perform a situated language task. So first, Kas did a behavioral study where he asked people to click on the second blue ball. Note that to us, the second blue ball automatically means the second in the set of blue balls, or of blue balls, the second one. However, formally, another interpretation is possible, and that's the second ball that happens to be blue, or the second and blue ball. And the question is, which meaning do people perceive, and which one is readily learned by the LSTM? So in the experiment with human participants, people overwhelmingly click on the second blue ball in the display, the circled one. There are only 3 instances in the entire data set where people did otherwise, with 1,600 trials and 29 participants. You can see that in orange. But if you ask an LSTM model to do this simple task, things turn out very differently. So you get a majority of linear second and blue responses. But if you add responses that are based on the labeling of hierarchical structured knowledge to the training routine of the model, the sequence model can then learn to give responses that over time become more similar to human behavior. But you have to give it that labeled data. It never matches it, so you can see the orange bar still compared in the LSTM compared to the error, but the model learns a conditional probability, which here is not sufficient to approximate syntactic structure. That doesn't mean that that's always the case, but in this particular case, that conditional probability is not sufficient to approximate what people know because of constituent structure. So we did these simulations with vectorized representations of our stimuli, but also with word embeddings. And we thought that the information latent in the word embeddings might help the models interpolate to combinations of cardinals like third and fourth red or green ball, even if they weren't trained on them. But the models are functionally approximating, if the models were actually functionally approximating syntactic structure, then this kind of generalization should be possible. So then we wanted to ask, can the models take advantage of information in the latent space of the embeddings that we haven't directly trained on? And the short answer is not really. So here you can see the percentage of correct hierarchical responses on both generalization tests after different types of training. So each drop reflects the average hierarchical accuracy on one simulation run. So the box plot reflects the overall distribution of this accuracy. The horizontal line reflects the mean accuracy of the model after random training, thus representing chance. We see that there isn't much difference as a function of the kind of training data. So for extrapolation, everything's at chance, but we expected that. And this is consistent with recent work by Brendan Lake and Marco Baroni. But for interpolation, we were hoping that the latent information in the word-to-vec embeddings would help us. I mean, it is slightly better, but still pretty bad. So for both the dimensionality reduced and the unreduced embeddings, we see a slight improvement in performance, but we think this boost in performance does in fact come from some of the similarity in, information that's available in the embeddings. And here we've made a heat map of the cosine similarity between all 300 dimensions of the word embeddings in A and between the 11 dimensions of the word embeddings in B. But you'll note that the embeddings capture the relatedness between blue and green and red as they're distributed in the embeddings. And this is indicated by a large and positive cosine similarity. And this is probably what is enabling the model to interpolate slightly better than chance, but nowhere approaching human behavior. So next, I want to briefly describe other efforts in the group to imbue language models with structure and oscillations, and how that might bring us steps closer to having models that have the sort of the basic ingredients of the properties that we're looking for. So this is the work of Dr. Sanne ten Uver, a postdoc in my group, and she started working on modeling a corpus of spoken Dutch conversations that were recorded during customer service calls, so full of natural speech. And she's interested in explaining how timing in speech and computation relate. So how the what and the when constrain each other. And the ultimate goal of relating the model that she's developing is to then be able to test it against neural data from natural speech, so MEG data that she's also collecting. And so far, she's begun by incorporating linguistic structural constraints as feedback in an RNN. And so these constraints were extracted from the spoken corpus. At the same time, she then forces neuroscientific principles on the model. So we make it have inhibition in a certain way, and we give it an internal rhythm to computation. And that tries to mimic, in a very broad stroke coarse way, how the brain computes in time. And she wants to see if adding these properties to a sequence model allows the model to better approximate human brain rhythms to speech and language. But of course, we're still in the model development phase here, so not yet able to compare to the MEG data. But she does find so far that we get a stronger rhythmic response from the RNN when the input timing matches the internal model's predictions. And interestingly, when combined with an internal model making onset predictions, an endogenous oscillation, so the non-isochronous sensory input that's coming in actually gives rise to a stronger rhythmic response. So you have your endogenous oscillation that is rhythmic, you have your quasi-rhythmic input, and you actually get a stronger rhythmic response from the whole network because of that contribution of the internal model. So sort of a way of taking your internal model and letting it normalize the perceptual input. So stay tuned for that. All right. So now we're going to go to the last section of the talk. That's again back to our formalisms and back to exploring what our models assume about our theories. And this is again the work of Kartikeya Kaushik, who got interested in the fact that most formalisms for language, when we were sort of sitting down as a lab and thinking about, okay, what formalisms can we take our path model seriously and use it to seed our modeling exercises? What formalisms are out there? And he got interested in the fact that most formalisms for language consider the end state representation, like that's the descriptive value of linguistics, which is really important, but doesn't include the representational status of representations, right? There's the representational status of processing as it's extended in time. That's really what he was getting at. So he's been working on a set and category theoretic description, which is what you see in front of you, which I'll explain in a second, of exactly that. So how can you describe the relationship between sequences of words and grammatical structures in time steps? So far we can express that the rules of grammar are discoverable based on abstractions made over a set of constituents. So this is a category theoretic push out here that's used as the glue between sets of linguistic representation. So here, words and phrases over time. So evidence for membership in an equivalence class Q is incrementally obtained in the sets T, I star. So there, a grammar can, whether you're forming a grammatical structure as a sequence can be incrementally evaluated on each one of those sets. So here then, a grammar is simply a way of identifying or restricting valid structures from an infinite set of possible structures as each word in the sequence comes in. Now that process is extended in time and not just in an end state. So we're hoping that this formal device will help us begin to include time and incrementality in our formal descriptions of language that would then shape how we did computational modeling and how we then would implement that. So this would allow us to mathematically describe how a given syntactic structure relates to a given sequence of words. And as you could imagine, once you have that formalism, you could express it in a model that then makes time step by time step predictions that we could then validate with MEG data. But of course, at this point, that is still very much a fantasy. But nonetheless, interesting work from Kartikeya. So I'll close by quickly summarizing a theoretical model that I've been developing since 2016. So in this model, the knowledge of language is combined with the speech signal using gain and inhibition by packaging information in time. That's a theme you've seen throughout the talk. And that's what leads to rhythmic signals in the brain. And of course, one existing implementation of such a model, of such a implementation that exists already would be something like Dora, but it's of course possible that there are other ways to express this. My goal here, though, in this conceptual model is to explain how hierarchical structure and compositionality might arise in neural networks bounded by known computational mechanisms in neuroscience, while taking into account time and incrementality. So it has a distinct analysis by synthesis flavor. So the latest incarnation of this model has recently been published in JOCN, and its core claims are here. I'll just summarize them for you. That linguistic structure arises in the temporal dynamics of neural networks as a form of perceptual inference. So sensory percepts cue an internal model of language, as I've spoken about through the talk, and those are all distributed codes. The temporal distribution of these activation patterns results in functionally linguistic structures, again, relating back to the work I talked about with Alex Dumas and Dora. And then it's gain modulation and crucially inhibition. These are the assembly level computations that produce representations of linguistic structure from sensory inputs. In the paper, I have a pseudocode, glossary, and a range of predictions. And I describe linguistic representations in this theory as trajectories in a manifold that render linguistic structure building as an expression of coordinate transform. So an operation that repeats across the brain, but multiplexed in time. So to sum up, if for the takeaway points I want you to take from this as I talk to you through my laptop is to be constrained by principles from what is known to be sort of like formal facts in your subject area. So in my subject area, that's be constrained by what we know about linguistics. How do we represent a constituent in the mind and brain? Still a burning question. Also be constrained by what we know about psychology, right? So that time matters for processing in computation, and also be constrained by what we know about in neuroscience. And you can do this for any question really, but I find it really crucial for language, right? And we can be constrained in these ways, but we have to sort of be, not to hammer it home too hard, but we have to be constrained by all of them at the same time. So not in separate lines. Again, successful predictions are not explanations. And a good model performance is not evidence that the representations at stake are actually being learned the way you think they are, or that what's being learned is being learned in a human-like or brain-like way. And again, this points back to the problems of algorithmic complexity from Kolmogorov and multiple realizability. These are just all very important things to keep in mind when you make your models. And to sum up, my research group is focused on trying to compute structure and be guided by statistics to incorporate time and rhythmic computation into our models. And so far, what we've the hints or the trails, the sort of crumbs that we find on the path in cognitive neuroscience is that phase synchronization seems to be really important for structure and meaning in the brain. And this is all sort of leading us to, or we're sort of stumbling towards a theory of how a neural system can represent language beyond statistical association alone. So now I'd like to thank my group for all of their hard work and generally for being wonderful people. And also I'd like to thank all of you for listening. Are you there?
Great. Thanks so much, Andrea. Yeah, I'll go through some questions. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to either type them in the Q&A. You can also, if you raise your hand, I'm able to allow you to speak if you'd like.
Should I stop sharing my screen or should I leave it up? Or
Why don't you leave it up?
Okay. Cool.
So one thing that you mentioned a number of times about a feature that we want these models to have is that they need to align with the constraints that we know from psychology or neuroscience. And so I was wondering if you could say more about how we decide whether a model meets those constraints or not, or do these need to be sort of explicit pieces that are in the model that we've built in, or can we treat the model as a kind of black box and just show that it behaves in a
Oh,
way that's consistent with these constraints?
no. That's a really good question. Actually, I'll be more nuanced. I'll say sometimes. So mostly I want to say no, I'm like, I don't know, I'm a hyper interpretabilityist, I guess would be the way to answer that. But more and more, actually, I think through the contributions of my students to trainees and mentees, I'm seeing how that's also often not tenable. So I'll talk about that in a second, but they really helped broaden my mind. So my instinct, of course, to say no. I want to, maybe it's too platonic or too purist. I want to start with, I want to know exactly what ingredients are in the model. So I want to know it has to have interpretable representational states. Um, that's sort of like if I was left alone by myself, that's what I would do. But maybe there's a question about how far I would get. But I think the practical way to go about it is to say when that's not possible, which it often isn't, this all leads back again to the problem of model-based choice. Like, and we run into this again and again as a team, like what do we cleave to and what do we let go? So when it's not possible, the one thing I will say is I don't think that saying that the behavior is consistent with the constraints is sufficient, because at least for my inference brain, it just leads back to the same fallacy where it's like, well, I don't know if that's because it's implementing a wildly different solution. So I think the practical solution there is to say, okay, if the things I have to measure about the model are its behavior, and I can't have the perfect, platonic world that Andrea dreams about where everything is fixed and interpretable and known, then what my compromise practical solution is to say, okay, I take a model like, for example, a model like Dora, which I know has the capacity to represent predicate calculus. And then I can test the outputs or the behavior of the model on things that go beyond what I'm assuming to be consistent with my constraints. Because I think that's the only way to sort of gently get a toe out or get a toe in the door to edge out of the problem that I talked about in the beginning, which is just because I've returned X, I conclude that what I'd like to label as the computation that's going on, that's being carried out. I don't know if this is answering your question because I can't see you, but what I was saying, the last part, what I was saying before about how my group has helped open my mind, is that a lot of the group has been interested in using a lot of tools out there that I would say fail definitionally to meet the requirements, right? So LSTMs and transformers and things like that. But from a practical point of view, I think it is still possible to go in to trying to model this problem knowing that you've made an assumption that is wrong. So if the world was perfect, which obviously it's not, you wouldn't do this. But I think it's just always the most important thing is to be honest with yourself about the assumptions that you're making.
Great, thanks. When you were presenting the path function model for theory building, the first two steps were framework and then theory. Could you say more about what the difference is between those two steps? Or are they both kind of before?
We get a lot of questions about that, actually. I was always, when we were developing this work together, I have to say I was always a little bit, that's not my favorite part, but Olivia made some great arguments for it, which I think still hold on. See if I'll just bring it back up. If this is actually possible for me to do it this way. Yes, okay. So here, I think this example is the best way to think about it. So, okay, already I'm like walking into the cognitive science like minefield. So I don't know if you would call ACT-R a theory. I'm tempted to call it a programming language, but no, it's okay. It's a model and it can be used to express different theories. I'll say that. But you can also think of it here as a framework. So maybe connectionism is a better example. Connectionism is a series of theoretical claims that's not necessarily a theory of one particular thing, but that's sort of populating. If you think about modeling in the extreme case, like you're making a model world, right? So you're going to populate it with some assumptions. The framework is sort of the first population of that, or the first like instantiation of that, right? The base assumptions in your world. Then a theory, of course, from a formal point of view, has a much stricter definition than a framework. I don't have a formal definition of framework, for example. The formal definition of theory is, of course, a topic for another day, but it exists and you can disagree about it. But there we're used to having a more specific claim, often in the form of a logical argument, for example. But here in the paper, we use examples like, let's see if I can move my little thing out of the way. We've got prospect theory or sustain, or even Rescorla-Wagner. There are different arguments to be made that all these things could fall into the category of theory. But I don't, please interrupt me if I'm not answering the question in the way that you are looking for. I don't think that you should, so the way that I think about it practically is framework is like the way that you're going to populate your little world of modeling. Theory is your specific sort of moving parts of the argument, the logical argument you want to make within that world, right? So something like X causes Y, right? But the fact that the X and Y exist, you've assumed in your framework. But the theory is that X causes Y. Does that help?
Great. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
For the EEG experiment that had the sentences and Jabberwocky and word list conditions, it reminds me of work, for example, from like Uri Hassan, who's done these kinds of scrambling things, and then he's been like testing whether this disrupts synchronization across people, right? So here you're measuring mutual information between people and the actual stimulus, right? And so that's right. So but I guess I'm curious if you think like the measuring synchronization across people would add something here, or are these rhythms really pretty person specific, or maybe there's parts of the model that have to be fit per person?
Yeah, I mean, EEG is kind of very, you know, it's a very flattened world. So already, I mean, the sort of next thing that we're doing now that we've got great access to MEG is doing versions of this study with MEG in different sources, and also looking for the mutual information between sources and the transfer entropy between sources to get a sort of better idea of what's going on in sort of the transmission of information across the networks, much like what Uri Hassan and other colleagues have managed to build of these sort of more whole brain kind of cool gradients or axes, which are really compelling. But here, like if I'm trying to, like I remember when we were trying to come up, so we use mixed effects models to analyze these data, and I like completely stand behind all of that, but we were having some sort of cool creative thinking about like, and also now that I've got more people in my group interested in applying machine learning to neuroimaging data and things like that, to different sort of cross-validation across people. And I think for some of the sort of big signals in EEG, it works okay, but we don't have nearly enough data to really do proper cross-validation. But my general sort of thing to say is that the variation across people is big enough that it's not a trivial problem. The way that I think that can go forward is actually we need either a lot more data from fewer people, or we need, so I think, so for gray to stimulate their experimental sentences that are created. So now we're collecting a more naturalistic data set with MEG right now, where we're having people listen to audiobooks. And I think there's sort of probably signals that we can take over the whole sort of summary of a person listening to an audiobook that might be comparable between people, but sort of the fine grain, like the more you zoom in on a source model or source localization or a particular signal, I think the more the variation gets in your way, so to speak. Although another really promising approach that's been popular in the lab these days is using temporal response functions. So almost all the postdocs in the group are really into this, and the PhD students too. And there's lots of other interesting groups using these. So Ed Lowler, Christian Broadbeck, and others have been successfully using these models. I don't know if you want me to talk more about them, or if you know about temporal response functions already, but basically it takes advantage of the fact that there's all this autocorrelation in both signals, in both the stimulus and in the brain response, and you can basically model that out with a ridge regression, and then you're able to really pick up on nuances in the brain response over and above the modulation of the continuous stimulus, which I think is a promising way to allow more sensitivity. There's also, in terms of mutual information, there's lots of cool work from Christoph Kaiser, Joachim Gross, Anna Keitel, Hyojin Park, using mutual information to look at signals between brain regions mostly for speech processing. So not yet on the level of language, but really compelling nonetheless.
Thanks. Something you mentioned near at the end of your talk was thinking about language perception as perceptual inference. So I
Yes.
was curious about that. My original training during my PhD was in the visual system, and so that's the kind of thing that vision people say a lot is
Yeah.
that right, you're getting these like little bits of information in your eyes, and your job in
Yeah.
the visual system is to like infer what the world actually is. So I'm curious if you think that's are you using a similar analogy
Yes.
for language, or what do you mean
Yes.
by that?
Yes. So, so now I'll like totally come clean. So as you know, I did my PhD at NYU and I was surrounded by vision. I was like one of the few people studying language there. But one of the things I guess that rubbed off on me is this, for the same way that I've always felt that language represents this capacity that just doesn't fit in with the rest of cognition, but it really should. And in fact, it has to, but we don't, we haven't yet seen how, is what I believe. But this sort of idea of conceptualizing it as a form of perceptual inference was really the way that I wanted to challenge myself. So in this paper I wrote in 2016, my first sort of model concept, like full theoretical model, that's the major assumption in it. I wanted to challenge myself. How far can I go to try to explain the unique or compelling formal facts about language while only assuming something as domain general as perceptual inference? Now, I wouldn't say that I've like completely, tested myself to the brink, but I think it's actually not so far off from a lot of the classical ideas that were in psychology of language and psycholinguistics, but just were never called that. I think at its core, it has the discipline already had a similar idea. But yes, the core idea is that, when you perceive a word, you're not perceiving it injectively or vertically in the same sense. It's a form of perceptual inference. You have a threshold level of evidence you need for a particular word, and your brain is filling in the rest. And there's lots of behavioral and also neural data that suggest that those phenomena have been well documented and well known for many years in the psychology and neuroscience of language. So yes, I would like to know how you feel about that. I know it's probably a much more laden term, or it has some other sort of sociological baggage in other fields than it would in language.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, in my lab, a lot of the kind of language processes we're looking at are sort of at the like narrative level, or right, so a few up higher levels up in the hierarchy, and so yeah, we think about it a lot as inference, that you're especially at that level, you're relying a lot on your priors about like what kind of events you think are possible in the world, right, and trying to figure out which of those to activate. And so yeah, I think it makes it. I like your idea of that sort of happening at all the levels of the system.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, great. If you don't have any other questions, Dr. Martin's also going to be having a coffee hour that's hosted by Women in Science at Columbia. If you're interested in joining, that's going to be in a different Zoom room that I just pasted in the chat if you're interested in switching over to that in a couple minutes. But great, thanks so much for joining us. Like I mentioned, I'll also be posting this online too, so so people on Twitter will have a chance to look at it too.
Thanks. Well, thank you for inviting me and having me. It was fun.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, so I'm going to disconnect now and pop over to the coffee hour.